"Sorry, sir, but you can't sit here." The voice of the flight attendant cut the air like a blade, while pointing to the middle-aged man who had just settled in the first class of American Airlines Flight 447. Miguel Santos, 52, raised his eyes calmly from the aviation magazine he was flipping through. His simple appearance brutally contrasted with the Italian suits and designer dress that dominated the premium Boeing 777 booth that flew from Los Angeles to Manila. "My seat is second," Miguel answered softly, showing the boarding card. His Filipino accent was loaded, but his posture radiated a strange serenity to someone who was being publicly embarrassed. The Stephanie Miller commissioner examined the card with visible skepticism. "Sir, this flight costs $12,000 per seat. Are you sure there was no mistake?" A murmur traced the first class. The businessman sitting next door, Richard Blackwood, sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He probably won in the lottery and decided to squander," murmured to his wife, who laughed discreetly. "Or maybe it's one of those cases of system error upgrade," added an elegant woman a few rows ago. "It happens when check-in people pay no attention." Miguel remained impassive, his calloused hands contrasting with the thin leather of the armchair. For years working on construction in the United States, he had learned that dignity was the only thing no one could get from it. But there was something in his eyes, a depth that suggested experiments far beyond airport works and prejudices. "Perhaps we should check with the supervisor," suggested Stephanie, clearly uncomfortable but unable to ignore the social pressure of other passengers. "No problem," Miguel answered quietly. "I have all the time in the world." Richard Blackwood leaned forward, his tone of voice loaded with condescension. "Look, friend, be honest with us. You really paid for this seat? Because if it was some scheme or fraud, you better admit now before you call security." Richard's wife, Patricia, typed discreetly on her cell phone, probably sharing the bizarre situation with her friends on social networks. "Honey, take a discreet photo. This will give the book club an incredible story." Miguel observed the movement around him with almost supernatural calm. During the last 5 years in the United States, he had faced all kinds of discrimination and humiliation, but he always kept his dignity intact, as if he kept a secret that no one else knew. "Mr. Santos," said Stephanie, returning with an even more confusing expression. "I spoke to the supervisor and, well, your card is valid in the system, but given the context of the situation, we would like to check your documents once again." "Context?" Miguel asked, slightly arching an eyebrow. Richard could not contain himself. "Let's be realistic here. You don't look exactly the kind of first class flying to Manila. What's your profession?" "Construction," Miguel simply responded, noting how the faces around the surroundings illuminated with a petty satisfaction. Finally, they had confirmed their suspicions. "Ah, I got it," Richard laughed, looking at the other passengers. "You must have saved this trip for years, right? Respect, man, but maybe next time it is more realistic with your spending." The elegant lady of some rows behind, identified by her Hermes bag as Clara Whitfield, joined the conversation. "It's admissible, I suppose. But does he understand that first class has certain behavior expectations? Isn't it like flying in the economy class?" Miguel closed the aviation magazine slowly, observing how each page showed aircraft he knew better than any manual. Boeing 777, Airbus A350, 747-8, models with which there had been thousands of hours. But these people saw only a Philippine immigrant out of place. "Sir," Stephanie's voice has returned now with a more authoritarian tone. "The captain would like to talk to you. It's security protocol when there are discrepancies in passenger documentation." The lie was obvious. There was no discrepancy, just prejudice disguised as a procedure. Miguel nodded calmly. "Sure. Where is he?" "In the command booth," Stephanie replied, clearly hoping that Miguel would be intimidated by the prospect of facing the maximum authority of the aircraft. Richard Blackwood laughed openly. "Now, they'll find out how he got this seat and solve this confusion at once." Patricia was already filming discreetly with her cell phone. "This will go viral. Filipino builder trying to impersonate the first-class passenger." What none of those people had the idea was that Miguel Santos was not just the ultra-immigrant Filipino trying to fly home. Behind that simple appearance and worked hands was hidden a story that would completely transform the arrogance of those passengers into something very different. As he walked towards the cabin of command, Miguel allowed an almost imperceptible smile. Throughout these years in the United States, working in construction sites under the scorching sun, facing contempt and racist comments, he had learned a valuable lesson. People see only what they want to see. Richard kept typing on his cell phone, documenting every moment for his social networks. "Guys, you won't believe what is happening on my flight. A guy clearly unable to travel first class. The commissioner's taking him to talk to the captain now." What Richard did not know was that each word typed was being witnessed by someone with the patience of those who had already faced much worse storms. literally storms at 35,000 feet altitude, with hundreds of lives depending on their accurate and millisecond decisions. There, before all the eyes of contempt and whispered comments, Miguel kept a serenity that only exists in those who keep too powerful secret to be revealed before the right time. Because sometimes the best revenge is not to react immediately, is to let people's own arrogance build the perfect stage for their own humiliation. As commanded by the command cabin, Miguel listened to Clara Whitfield to comment out loudly so that everyone would hear. Frankly, these airlines need to be more strict with those in the first class. We pay a premium value precisely to avoid this type of situation. Miguel stopped for a moment before the metal door that separated the command cabin from the rest of the aircraft, a door he knew better than his own home, a door behind which was someone who would completely change the course of that humiliating situation. If you are feeling your indignation grow with this public humiliation, and want to find out how a simple misunderstanding would become the most expensive lesson that these passengers would receive about judging people by appearance, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what would happen when that door opened would prove that underestimating someone can be the most expensive mistake a person makes in life. The command cabin door opened with a soft click, revealing Captain James Morrison, a 58-year-old man with gray hair and impeccable uniform. His experienced eyes passed quickly by Miguel before they settled in Stephanie. "What's the problem?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of those who commanded aircraft 3 decades. "Captain, we have a situation with a first-class passenger," Stephanie explained, lowering his voice. "There are discrepancies about how he got the seat. The other passengers are uncomfortable." Morrison looked straight at Miguel. "Documents, please." Miguel calmly delivered his American passport and boarding card. Morrison examined each page meticulously, his expression remaining neutral while checking the entry and exit stables of recent years. "Everything seems to be in order," Morrison finally said, returning the documents. "What exactly is the problem?" Stephanie hesitated. "Well, Captain, he works in construction and Morrison interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "The other passengers questioned how someone with this profession could pay first class," Stephanie added, clearly uncomfortable when verbalizing prejudice. Morrison sighed deeply. "Mrs. Miller, since when the profession of a passenger is a criterion for flying first class? If the documents are in order and the payment has been approved, there is no discussion." As the conversation was taking place, Richard Blackwood had risen and walked to the command of the command cabin, clearly impatient. "Sorry to interrupt, but how long will this take? I have important meetings in Manila." "Mr. Blackwood, go back to your seat, please," Morrison answered firmly. "Look, Captain, I don't want to sound insensitive, but we all pay a premium value for this experience," Richard insisted, gesturing toward Miguel. "And frankly, there are certain expectations when flying first class." Morrison stepped ahead, his posture stiffen. "Mr. Blackwood, suggesting that we discriminate passengers based on his appearance or profession?" "I'm not suggesting discrimination," Richard responded quickly, realizing that he had stepped on dangerous ground. "Just questioning how someone who works in works got $12,000 for this flight." Miguel remained silent, observing the dynamics unfolding. There was something familiar in the posture of Morrison, in the way he defended basic principles of human dignity. It was the kind of leader Miguel respected, someone who didn't bow to social pressure when integrity was at stake. "Since anyone gets money, Mr. Blackwood," Morrison answered dryly, "working, and frankly how he spent his money is not our own." Patricia Blackwood had joined her husband, holding her cell phone discreetly. "Captain, we understand his position, but perhaps an additional verification would be prudent, for everyone's security." The insinuation was clear. A Philippine immigrant was automatically a security threat. Miguel felt a familiar twinge of pain, the same as he felt when supervisors questioned his competence based only on his origin. "Mrs. Blackwood, I suggest that they return to their seats immediately," Morrison said, her patience clearly exhausted. "Lord Santos, I deeply regret this situation. It can return to your seat." As they walked back to the first class, Miguel noticed how all their eyes turned to him. Clara Whitfield whispered something to the woman next door, probably speculating about the result of the investigation. "Then?" Richard asked as soon as Miguel went through his seat. "All enlightened?" "Perfectly," Miguel answered calmly, settling again in second. Richard could not hide his frustration. "Interesting. Well, I hope you understand that this situation was unusual for all of us." Miguel opened his aviation magazine again, but this time Richard noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. The Philippine was not just flipping through, reading technical articles on navigation systems and security protocols with a professional concentration. "Interested in aviation?" Richard asked, trying to sound casual. "I have always been," Miguel answered simply. "Hobby or professional interest?" Miguel raised his eyes from the magazine, a small smile touching his lips. "Let's say it's an old passion. Something in Miguel's voice made Richard feel uncomfortable. There was a subtle confidence there, as if Miguel knew something that others didn't know. Patricia, still filming discreetly, whispered to her husband, "Honey, did you notice how he talks about aviation? Almost as if what?" Richard interrupted. "As if you really understand the subject." For the next 2 hours, while Boeing 777 crossed the Pacific, Miguel remained quiet, reading his magazine and occasionally looking out the window. But Richard and Patricia couldn't stop watching him, an uncomfortable curiosity growing every minute. Clara Whitfield, unable to resist, approached during the dinner service. "Sir, saints, don't you? Forgive my curiosity, but you look very familiar with aeronautical terminology. Have you worked in the sector?" Miguel calmly chewed his salmon before answering. "I worked with machines all my life. Airplanes are just more complex machines." The answer was technically true but vaguely unsatisfactory. Clara returned to her seat with more questions than answers. What none of them realized was that every question, every suspect look, every prejudiced comment was being mentally catalogued by Miguel. For years in the United States, he had learned to silently document each injustice, every moment of discrimination. But this time it would be different. This time the truth would come to light in a way that none of them could predict or control. While the aircraft flying through the dark night over the Pacific, Miguel closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember. Remember the days when you didn't have to hide, when your name was respected and your unquestionable expertise. Remember why I had chosen that specific flight at that specific date. Each new humiliation only strengthened something within him that his oppressors could not see, a silent determination being fed by his own injustice they tried to impose, without knowing that they were about to find out who was the man who had chosen to underestimate. 3 hours passed since the initial embarrassment, and Flight 447 crossed silently over the Pacific Ocean. Most of the passengers in the first class had fallen asleep, but Richard Blackwood remained awake, bothered by something he could not identify. Miguel Santos continued to read his aviation magazine, occasionally making notes on the banks with a pen that Richard now realized to be a Mont Blanc, a detail that did not fit the building worker image they had built. "Honey," Patricia whispered to her husband, "have you noticed that he didn't sleep once? And those notes he makes, they look very technical." Richard noted in disguise as Miguel became a page on GPS navigation systems at commercial aircraft. It was not a casual reading. It was the kind of meticulous analysis that only industry professionals would do. "Sorry to bother," Richard finally said, leaning toward Miguel's seat. "I'm curious about aviation too. What are you reading?" Miguel lifted his eyes calmly. "Comparative analysis between TCAS systems from different manufacturers." Interested in the subject? The answer left Richard momentarily speechless. TCAS was an extremely technical anti-collidarity system that only pilots and aeronautical engineers knew deeply. Where did you learn about it?" Richard asked, his initial arrogance giving way to genuine curiosity. "Experience," Miguel answered simply, returning to reading. Richard's discomfort increased when he noticed that Miguel not only read the articles, but mentally corrected information on the margins. Who was this man, really? 2 hours later, a moderate turbulence hit the aircraft. While other passengers clung to the seats, Miguel remained completely relaxed, as if he knew exactly what to expect. "Aren't you worried?" Patricia asked, noting her unwavering calm. "Clear air turbulence over the North Pacific," Miguel explained quietly. "Normal for this route and altitude. It should last about 15 minutes. The forecast was accurate. 15 minutes later, the aircraft returned to the soft flight. Richard and Patricia exchanged significant looks. How could a construction worker have such a specific knowledge about flight meteorological patterns? Clara Whitfield, who had observed the whole interaction, approached again. "Mr. Santos, forgive my insistence, but your familiarity with aviation is impressive. Have you considered working in the sector?" Miguel smiled subtly. "I already worked as a mechanic of aircraft," Clara pressed. "Among other things," Miguel answered evasively. The vague answer only intensified everyone's curiosity. At dawn, while the cabin was immersed in the darkness, Richard could not sleep. Something about Miguel Santos did not fit, and the more I thought, the more obvious it was that there was something important being omitted. At 4 a.m. local time, an unexpected situation would test all his suspicions dramatically. A strange sound echoed through the aircraft, a subtle metallic noise that most passengers have not even noticed. Miguel, however, instantly raised his head, his expression changing for the first time throughout the flight. He knew that sound. It was the primary hydraulic system with smaller irregularities. Not even dangerous, but something that required immediate attention. Stephanie Miller walked down the hallway by checking the passengers when Miguel called her discreetly. "Sorry, but can I talk to Captain Morrison? It's about a technical issue." "A technical question?" Stephanie arched her eyebrows. Lord, with all due respect, the Lord works in civil construction. Please, Miguel insisted, his voice carrying a subtle urgency that made Stephanie hesitate. It's important. Richard had woken up and watched the interaction with increasing fascination. The Philippine who had humiliated hours before now showed a technical confidence that simply made no sense. Okay, Stephanie gave way, clearly reluctant, but if it's a waste of time, it won't be, Miguel assured, rising and walking toward the command booth. As they approached the metallic door, Stephanie noticed something that made her perplexed. Miguel walked the corridors of the aircraft with the familiarity of those who had made that route thousands of times, not as a passenger, but as someone who really knew every detail of that machine. Captain Morrison? Stephanie knocked on the door. Mr. Santos would like to talk about a technical issue. The door opened, revealing Morrison with an expression of slight irritation. Mr. Santos, I hope it is really important. We are in the midst of routine checks. Primary hydraulic system, Miguel said without preambles. Auxiliary pump featuring micro vibrations. Pressure still inside the parameters but trending downward in the last 2 hours. Morrison stopped completely. This was an extremely specific analysis of a problem they had noticed in the instruments only 10 minutes earlier. How do you know that? Morrison asked, studying Miguel with new attention. The sound, Miguel explained simply, and the slight vibration in the fuselage, not yet dangerous but worth monitoring. The Kyo pilot, Thomas Wright, looked through the cabin. Captain, he's right. We were just discussing that. Morrison advanced one step toward Miguel, his expression changing completely. Mr. Santos, can I ask what exactly your experience with aviation is? Miguel hesitated for a moment, looking through the small cabin window to the instrument panel lights. For 5 years in the United States, he had maintained his true identity, buried under the disguise of construction worker. But this specific situation required honesty. I have some experience with Boeing 777, he said carefully. What kind of experience? Wright pressed. Miguel looked straight into Morrison's eyes, the type that teaches you how to recognize every sound this aircraft can do. At that moment, something changed in the cabin of command. Morrison and Wright exchanged a look that suggested recognition, as if they were finally beginning to understand who was really before them. But before they could ask more questions, Miguel added something that would make the whole puzzle start to fit in. If you want, I can help with the complete diagnosis. I know this specific model well. The way it said, this specific model carried a familiarity that could only come from years of practical experience. Morrison immediately realized that she was not dealing with an ordinary passenger pretending to have technical knowledge. While the conversation took place at the command cabin, Richard and Patricia watched through the curtain cracks, completely fascinated. The man who had despised and humiliated was now consulted by the crew on complex technical issues of the aircraft itself. The slow and devastating fulfillment was beginning to graduate in the minds of the passengers who had judged Miguel Santos based only on their appearance. They had made a much greater mistake than simply being rude with a fellow passenger. They had underestimated someone whose true identity was about to completely rewrite everything they thought to know about competence, expertise, and the price of judging people by appearance. Captain Morrison, Miguel said calmly, can I check the hydraulic instruments? I would like to confirm a suspicion. Morrison hesitated for just a second before giving Miguel room approaching the panel. What happened next left the entire command cabin in absolute silence. Miguel moved by controls with precision that could only come from years of experience. Its fingers found each button, each display, each indicator with the familiarity of those who had spent thousands of hours in that exact cockpit. Hydraulic pressure system 1, 2,850 psi, trending down, Miguel murmured, reading the instruments as if they were extensions of their own senses. Automatic backup system will activate in about 40 minutes if the fall continues at this pace. Thomas Wright looked at Morrison with a complete shock expression. Captain, these numbers, they are exact. How can he? Who are you really? Morrison interrupted, studying Miguel with new intensity. Miguel turned slowly, his eyes finding Morrison's. I'm someone who knows this Boeing 777-300 or specific model better than any manual. The voltage in the cabin was palpable. Morrison took a step forward. Mr. Santos, I need it to be completely honest with me. What is your true experience with aviation? Miguel took a deep breath. For 5 years he had kept his secret identity, working as a construction worker, supporting humiliation and prejudice. But this specific situation no longer allowed evasive. Captain Miguel Santos, he said simply. Philippine Airlines, 22 years of experience in Boeing 777, retired 5 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison and Wright looked at each other, processing the devastating information they just received. Are you pilot? Wright stammered. Era, Miguel corrected. Senior captain. More than 15,000 hours of flight, most in 777s. Morrison sat heavily in her chair. Jesus Christ, and you were sitting in the first class being treated as a Philippine immigrant who didn't deserve to be there, Miguel completed. Yes. At that moment, through the intercom, Stephanie's voice came to them. Captain, first-class passengers are asking about Mr. Santos. They want to know if everything is okay. Morrison looked at Miguel, a mixture of respect and shame in her eyes. Lord, Captain Santos, with your permission, would like to make an announcement. Miguel nodded. Do what to find correct? Morrison took the microphone from the aircraft's communication system. His voice echoed through the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Captain Morrison. I would like to inform you that we have the honor of having on board Captain Miguel Santos, retired Philippine Airlines pilot with over 20 years of experience in Boeing 777. In the first class, the impact of revelation was like a bomb. Richard Blackwood stopped typing in the middle of a sentence. Patricia dropped her cell phone. Clara Whitfield was completely still. Captain Santos, Morrison continued, his voice full of genuine admiration, kindly watched us with a technical verification of routine, demonstrating once again that experience and professionalism transcend any cultural or social barrier. Richard looked at Patricia, her pale face of realization. For hours they had humiliated a commercial aircraft captain, a man whose experience surpassed anyone on that flight. Miguel returned to the first class walking with the same silent dignity as before, but now each passenger watched him with a mixture of respect and deep shame. Captain Santos, Richard started, his voice shakes. Miguel stopped next to Richard's seat. Yes, Mr. Blackwood? I need to apologize, Richard said, his arrogance completely destroyed. We had no idea who you really were. And should that matter? Miguel asked calmly. Does my profession determine if I deserve to be treated with dignity? The question hit Richard as a punch. He realized the depth of his prejudice. He had not only judged Miguel for his appearance, but now he was apologizing just because he discovered his social position. Clara Whitfield approached, clearly mortified. Captain Santos, please accept our most sincere excuses. Our behavior was inexcusable. Undiscular, Michael repeated, considering the word. For 5 years in the United States, I worked on civil construction. Every day I faced the same kind of judgment you have shown today. Patricia tried to justify. But Captain, if we had known that you were a pilot. Exactly, Miguel interrupted. If they had known. But what if I was really just a construction worker? That would make me less worthy of respect? The question echoed through the cabin as a sentence. Each passenger was forced to confront the depth of his own prejudices. Miguel continued. For 22 years I flew aircraft like this, transporting people from all backgrounds, all professions, all social classes. I never considered some passenger who was less deserving respect based on their appearance or profession. Stephanie approached, visibly thrilled. Captain Santos, in the name of the whole crew, apologized. Our behavior was shameful. Miguel smiled kindly. Stephanie, you were following protocols you have learned in a system that teaches how to question certain more than others. Real change begins when we recognize these standards. Richard was recording now, not to post about a problem in the first class, but documenting his own humiliation. Captain, can I ask why you didn't reveal your identity before? Miguel returned to his seat, accommodating with the same tranquility as always. Because it should not have been necessary, and because I wanted to see how far you would take your judgments. The answer was devastating in its simplicity. Miguel had allowed them to completely reveal their true character before showing their own. During the remaining hours of the flight, the first class remained in respectful silence. Each passenger was forced to reflect on how his privileges and prejudices had been exposed as humiliating as possible, not through revenge or cruelty, but through the revelation of his own ignorance in the face of true excellence. Miguel Santos had achieved something rare, a perfect revenge that did not destroy their oppressors, but forced them to destroy their own illusions of superiority, proving that the most powerful justice is the one that forces people to see the reality they have always chosen to ignore. 6 months after that flight that changed everything, Miguel Santos was standing on the podium of the International Civil Aviation Conference in Chicago. His lecture on dignity and diversity in commercial aviation had gathered more than 1,000 professionals from the world aeronautical sector. Aviation does not know borders, Miguel told the microphone, his voice echoing through the crowded auditorium. But unfortunately, our prejudices still insist on creating divisions where bridges should exist. In the front row, Richard Blackwood was sitting, taking grades frantically, not as an arrogant passenger mocking an immigrant, but as director of human resources from a large airline, trying to implement inclusion policies based on Miguel's recommendations. After the viral incident, Patricia's video had reached 50 million views with the title, We humiliated an aircraft captain. Richard lost his executive position in the consulting firm. The public exposure of his racist behavior has not only cost her employment, but millionaire contracts and reputation built over decades. Mr. Blackwood came to me 3 months ago. Miguel continued his talk, not to justify himself, but to learn. And that demonstrates something fundamental. People can change when confronted with the reality of their actions. Richard had spent months in therapy, participating in discussion groups on racial privilege and working voluntarily in organizations that helped immigrants. The transformation was genuine and painful. He lost friends, social status, and almost marriage, but gained something he had never had: real awareness of the impact of his attitudes. Patricia, sitting next to her husband, held a copy of Miguel's book, Flying Beyond Prejudice: Lessons of Dignity to 35,000 Feet. His own journey of conscience began when he realized that he was teaching the same toxic values for his children. Clara Whitfield had used her social influence to create the Whitfield Foundation for Aeronautical Education, offering complete scholarships for young people from needy aviation communities. His first beneficiary was a young Filipino from Los Angeles, who dreamed of being a pilot. Miguel continued, "The true measure of our civilization is not as we deal with those we consider our equals, but how we deal with those we judge different from us." Stephanie Miller, now American Airlines training supervisor, applauded in the second row. The cultural sensitization program she had developed based on Flight 447 was now a mandatory standard for the entire crew of the company. Captain Morrison, who had become Miguel's mentor in his new career as aviation consultant, proudly watched behind the scenes. The detailed report that had written about the incident resulted in permanent changes in customer service protocols from various airlines. "For 5 years I worked under construction in the United States," Miguel revealed to the auditorium, "not by financial need, but because I wanted to understand what it was like to be judged only by appearance. Every day of prejudice taught me something about resilience and human dignity." The revelation caused a murmur in the auditorium. Miguel had deliberately chosen a profession that would expose him to prejudice, documenting each experience to better understand the discrimination that many immigrants face. Flight 447 was not an accident, Miguel continued. "I chose that specific flight on that date because I knew it would be an environment where my true identity would remain hidden enough to reveal the true values of the people around me." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the humiliation he felt when he realized how he had treated a world respected, but also of the unexpected gratitude for having received a second chance to become a better person. Miguel concluded his talk. "The best revenge is not to destroy those who harm us. It is to give them the opportunity to become better versions of themselves, while we build a fairer world for all." After the conference in the hotel lobby, Miguel was approached by a young Filipino pilot. "Captain Santos, thanks for making people possible like me dream of careers in American aviation." Richard approached hesitantly. "Captain, can I have a minute?" Miguel nodded. "Of course, Richard. I want you to know that that day on the flight was the worst and the best of my life," Richard said, his voice full of genuine emotion. "Worse because I found out who I really was. Better because it gave me a chance to become who should have been always." Miguel reached out. "Richard, the royal journey begins when we stop defending ourselves and began to transform." While walking down Chicago Airport that night, Miguel reflected on how a simple decision to gradually reveal his identity had created waves of change that spread far beyond that initial flight. Your phone rang. It was a message from Philippine Airlines. "Captain Santos, we would like to offer him the position of International Director of Diversity Programs. Starting salary, $250,000 per year." Miguel smiled, looking through the huge windows of the airport to the lights of the dark aircraft in the darkness. Each carried hundreds of stories, hundreds of people who deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or origin. True victory had not been to humiliate prejudiced people, but creating a system where future generations of pilots, commissioners, and passengers would not have to choose between hiding their identity or facing discrimination. Miguel Santos had proved that the most powerful revenge is not one that destroys enemies, but the one that transforms enemies into allies and builds bridges where there were only walls of prejudice and ignorance before. If this story DN transformation and second chance has touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel to discover more stories that prove that true greatness is to raise others, even those who have once tried to diminish us, because the best revenge is always the one that makes the world a better place for everyone.